Hello, my name is Anne-Marie Cannon, and I'm the host of Armchair Historians. What's your favorite history? Each interview on this podcast begins with this one question. Our guests come from all walks of life, YouTube celebrities, historians, to my next-door neighbor. They're people who love history and get really excited about a particular time, place, or person from our distant or not-so-distant past. The jumping-off point is a place where they became curious, then entered the rabbit hole into discovery, fueled by an unrelenting need to know more. We look at history through the filter of other people's eyes. Armchair Historians is a Belgian Rabbit production. Stay up to date with us through Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Wherever you listen to your podcast, that is where you'll find us. Armchair Historians is an independent, commercial-free podcast. If you'd like to support the show and keep it ad-free, you can buy us a cup of coffee through Ko-fi, or you can become a patron through Patreon. Links to both in the episode notes. A couple weeks ago on social media, I posed the question to my followers, who's your favorite historical villain? And here's what people had to say about it. Veronica May said, tough question, so many to choose from. H.H. Holmes, La Malinche, while Kevin Kuharik gave an emphatic H.H. Holmes. Two respondents said Donald Trump. One of those people used the caveat, but I can't use his name with favorite anything. Genghis Khan got Robert Gray Graham's vote, and John, King of England, got Stephanie Marie Smith's vote. To see more answers or to tell us your favorite, go to our Instagram or Facebook page, and while you're at it, be sure to like and follow. Today, my guest is Nicki Woodard. Nicki is the host and producer of the podcast As the Money Burns, a deep exploration into the lives of actual heirs and heiresses to some of America's most famous fortunes. The podcast explores what happens to them when the Great Depression hits. As the Money Burns is part audio drama, part documentary, and part contemporary commentary. According to Nicki, she first merged her passions of history and media, making video documentaries for History Fair. Yeah, it's like science fair, but history, using her father's Super VHS studio. Since then, she went on to earn a BA in history, a BS in radio, television, and film, and a master's degree in Middle Eastern studies. She has worked on multiple documentaries for the History Channel and A&E Network. She served as research consultant for Mr. Robot and Briar Patch. In search of a project for film and television, Nicki stumbled onto an article about a summer's events in Newport, Rhode Island in 1929, just a few months before the infamous Wall Street crash. Down the rabbit hole she went. After further digging, she discovered a world of heirs and heiresses whose lives paralleled her own. All except for the money part. After years of developing the idea, Nicki has turned those stories into the As the Money Burns podcast. Nicki Woodard, welcome, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. This is going to be so much fun.
Oh, I'm telling you, I'm into it. And just for the listeners who maybe haven't followed me on social media, this was one of the episodes in which I was inspired to dress up in vintage 1920s attire. If you want to see my costume, go to my social media and you'll be able to see. Nicki, what I usually do is just get right into the conversation with the leading question, which is, what's your favorite history that you're going to be talking about today?
Well, today I'm going to be talking about the 1920s and the Great Depression, because I have a podcast called As the Money Burns, which just came out this year. It covers the lives of actual heirs and heiresses to some of America's most famous fortunes when the Great Depression hits. And so what happens? Who keeps their fortune? Who loses it? The scandals that come around them, the love triangles, the failed marriages, all the chaos that can happen. And what I do is I follow a group of people, because usually when we learn a people's history, we learn one person. You would cover someone's biography and you would cover from birth to death. And you just like, this might be just a footnote or a little fact. And instead, I really go into what their lives were for those several years and what it is to other people. So you see, like, did they make a good decision or a bad decision? What did they think was their decisions? when they made that decision, why do they choose that path versus another? What are the results of alternative choices?
I have taken a deep dive into the podcast, and it is amazing. Your approach to it, all the work and research you put into it, and I've never seen this in a podcast. You have this approach. Each podcast episode is in 3 parts, and the first part is a narrative, which I assume you've written yourself. And
Yes.
and it just brings, for me, it brings me into it because, I love historical fiction. Then the other thing, and what I liked yesterday when I was driving in the car, listening to your podcast, is when I listen to something or watch something about history, I end up Googling things because I want to know, the story. I want to know the story. I want to do the research. So when I'm driving in the car yesterday, you follow up your narrative with the history, with the actual history. And when you're driving in the car, it's not good to Google when you're driving.
Yeah.
So I like that because it kind of fed that part of me. Then the other thing that you do in the part 3 is you bring it into the present. And I just listened to one of the episodes that talked about the Vanderbilt family, and you talked about Anderson Cooper and his mother, Gloria Van. It was, and it just brings it into the future in some way. You bring it into the future, whether it's actually following the trajectory of the heir or heiress's family, or whether it's just this is relevant today because we're in a pandemic. That's my endorsement. And then the other thing, and then I'm going to stop talking and let you talk, that I love about it is it brings you into the moment in this narrative, but then you kind of move away, and then you see this big picture of a bigger context of these families and what was going on, how the outside world affected them, and how their small circle interacts with each other and then the rest of the world. There's just so much to it.
I've been a lover of history since I was in 3rd grade. I got hooked with the story of Pocahontas. Then later in 4th grade, I realized that those fairy tales we love so much, actually, they're real queens and princesses all around the world. I've just dove into history ever since then. I went to film school, at the same time at University of Texas, I got a BA in history, as well as getting my BS in film and TV. I did documentaries in high school. I worked for the History Channel for several years. I got a master's degree in Middle Eastern Studies, which was focused on history because I love international royalty dynastic histories. And so what I really love is what I don't like is when you keep hearing the same story, but you're missing so much of the other element. And I decided this back in high school. If I'm going to work that hard, I have to love the subject. When we learn history, you learn the history of England, you learn the history of France, you learn the history of Spain, and once in a while you get the crossover. But when you really sit there and you compare, you find out, King Henry VIII is at the time, he was such a small, insignificant person. He is now significant for who we are today and what the world became. But at the time, the Ottoman Empire and the Empire of India, which is what I studied in Middle Eastern Studies, Mughal and Ottoman, were the powerhouses. And then France was significantly strong. And when I went to visit Europe, I went through a castle and I saw a little engraving with all 4 rulers and wrote a paper on the significance of all 4 of them together and who was ranked what and the politics. And so the same thing goes with these people. It's we know who Barbara Hutton is, and you can look at her story and she's been married 7 times. You can look at Doris Duke, she's been married 2 times. You can Wikipedia and find out how they died. But what we don't understand is how they became the way they were. And that Barbara Hutton and Doris Duke are born less than 2 weeks apart. They were compared their whole entire lives together. And when you read their biographies, you will see references to one, but you only see a reference. And half the time they'll get the fact wrong. They'll get the birth order, the age difference. If it's a book on Doris, they do not get the Barbara Hutton facts correct. And when you go back and you're reconstructing this time period, I connected with it because I had similar life experiences. How I discovered this is I worked in entertainment. I was trying to develop a history-related project. and I stumbled across a little gossip column about what happened in Newport in the summer of 1929. And I'm like, wait, that's 2 months before the stock market crash.
Yeah, yeah.
And the parallel is when I was 17, I did a summer program at Brown University and went, which is in Rhode Island, and went 2 days to Newport. So I had heard about the mansions when I was 17, but I was a poor little girl. So I just went to the beach where it was free and then like ate a little restaurant with some of my classmates. But I did have my summer love. It was in the middle of a very difficult year of my life. And when I came home, my brother who had cancer died within a few months. So that's a very significant part of my adolescence. So when I started digging up the information about who was living in Newport at the time and the stories, I found out that I had already known about Barbara Hutton and Doris Duke, but they were my age. They were 16, 17 that year. They were my age at Newport. And then what happened to them in their lives afterwards, like their marriages, the divorces, even if it's 40 years into the future, like I could relate all of it. And this year I was like, hit a block of what I could do with a TV series and decided to turn it into a podcast. And then the question was, what do you do? And I go, wait, this is podcasting. There's no limitation. You know what?
Yeah.
I get to choose how to do it myself. If you get just the history, you're missing the emotional. And the first part is to get you the emotional. To remember, you're a 16-year-old girl, 17-year-old girl. You're a woman in love with her husband. Like, why are you emotionally making these choices? How do you feel? The second part is the facts. We want to know what that stuff is. If you do a narrative, one little reference is 3 pages of material explaining that one little word. And then because it's the pandemic, it was like, why would we care about wealthy people? And that was a question I always had for 7 years trying to develop this story. And it was like, because once we stop looking at their wealth, they're people.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm picking people with divorce, suicide. A fact is her mother didn't love her. Well, they don't have a lot of scenarios explaining that or showing that. And that's what I'm trying to do is like each episode's 20 minutes, but it covers suicide. It covers how these people are connected to the discovery of King Tut's tomb.
That was a great episode. That was your narrative was so good. I was in it. I was so in it.
And that's where my royalty and my love of all history comes in, because I get to dig in and I get to I see barely a reference and I'm going, wait, that's another fact I got to pull out. The reason I have so many characters is because, and just trying to cover 2 or 3 people's backgrounds, I kept stumbling across a particular person's name. I found this opera singer who ends up having this fabulous story. She was like 2 references in Doris Duke's story. She's mentioned here in Barbara Hutton, and then you go over somewhere else and you see Cobina Wright. Same came with Jakey Astor. And then when you dig into their stories and reconstruct their stories, you run across even more stories. You don't want to tell a story if I just tell you Barbara Hutton, because that's interesting, but that's also 20 documentaries on her. When Barbara Hutton is dealing with Cobina Wright or Jakey Astor, and you're kind of going, are you sure that really happened? And it's like, well, I don't have proof, but they're all running around. I have newspaper articles that say they're all in the same place, or they're all right next to each other, or they have this influence or that influence. You got to have fun with it. Let's go back and then also let us relate to how it relates to us. You just remember your own first love and what it's like to be in the summer, especially after the pandemic strips so many young people of that rite of passage.
Yeah.
And when the Great Depression hits, they get criticized for just wanting to do what they were raised to do, like to have a debutante ball. And I think right now, with what happened this last year, we relate to it going like, well, yeah, they could have a ball. Maybe they should be a little discreet about it, but you don't completely just strip a person of it if they can have a part of it. Like, you start to realize why that was such an important memory for you.
What helps, I don't think I would be as interested in this concept of humanizing people that are that wealthy, but because I know about, this is going to sound weird, but because I know about Anderson Cooper and I like him and I respect him as a journalist. Just before his mother died, that book came out and they talked about their relationship and the history of his mother, who I knew because of her genes. right?
Hmm.
Gloria Vanderbilt James. There is that continuity. And I feel like he really humanized his family and gave us information about how it all started for him. And so I think you do an amazing job of humanizing people to the point where I can relate to these people.
Well, it's like Gloria actually is somewhat part of the story. She's 5 years old when our story begins, and there is things that are happening to her, and she's actually like she was a good little playmate to Kabina's daughter. Like I said, they keep coming in and colliding where you're going like, well, I can only focus. It's like, no, we're gonna find a way to incorporate all of them.
Well, I know that I had to go back and listen to 2 episodes twice because you can't listen to it and work and do other things. It's not that kind of a podcast. When did you decide to do the podcast?
Actually, it occurred to me in February. So I had started my research in February to turn it into a podcast to release in June. June is National History Month. The documentary competition I did in high school was called History Fair, and Nationals was in June. And I was going to time it to release around the time of Nationals. Now, I never made it to Nationals. I only got to state. But when COVID struck, I was like, wait, I just thought we were going to have like maybe 2-3 months of isolation. So I was like, if I publish after isolation, I lost my captive audience. There's so many fun things that if you tell it the way I think the average person would normally tell the story, I think you're missing the new side and the new information that we don't normally know.
I see this as being like a really great series somewhere along the lines of Downton Abbey.
Yeah, the pitch used to be Downton Abbey meets Gossip Girl, or now The Crown, where Crown is heavily researched. There is still fictional components to it.
Yeah.
But there's leeway. At the same time, I'm such a nerd. It's like, I have to tell the history facts. I have to tell the history facts. I have to let people know. I was like, yeah, I'm playing with the history in this section, but I'm not ignoring the real facts. And I'm doing my best to respect them in all capacities, but I need some leeway to get to the emotions.
So would you envision a series having the 3-part in every episode? Or
I don't think so. I think that's where it got to be unique to podcasting. And I think that's why I really fell in love with podcasting. When I realized I don't have to have anybody's approval, I don't have to have anyone's notes. I'm just going to say it exactly the way I want to. And then at least, whatever path it takes later, it can take. But at least I got out my section. I got out my creative side. I got out my history side, my personal emotional side.
Well, the implications of this content that you've created, because I was thinking about this yesterday, is all encompassing. You could write a book. Somebody's going to want that series because you have put your heart and soul into the research, and you are a stickler for the historical record and the facts. But at the same time, you indulge us with the narrative where you bring us into a scenario that you imagine. I'm really in awe of what you're doing. And
I like, the thing is, I like science fiction. I like all that stuff, but history is my heart. I broke these into tiny episodes, 20 minutes, so that I could focus on a subject. I see it as I'm telling a soap opera. Each episode follows a theme. The one I just released today is on tennis. I have an episode on suicide. I'll have multiple episodes on suicide. I even talk in the suicide episode. I talk about my history with suicide, where it's very deeply personal.
Tell us the name of your podcast, and do you have a website?
Yes, it's all As the Money Burns. So that is my podcast. That is my website. That's my Instagram. That's my Facebook page. That's everywhere I could market, or I should market, as far as I know.
As the Money Burns. So is it asthemoneyburns.com?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So where do we see this history in pop culture? And I know it's hard to answer because it's everywhere, but go ahead, take a stab.
Oh, it is. You like fashion. I loved your little flapper gear. Here's some things like, in time, I will cover it as well in the podcast. But so we see in the 1920s and 30s, we see Art Deco. Art Deco is a combination of multiple cultures. It's Persian, it's Egyptian, it's part Assyrian, and then French. It was developed in France primarily, and it really took a big stride in the 30s. So one Egyptian was partially because King Tut's tomb was discovered in the early 1920s. And so that, like, we always had a fascination with Egyptian history. Like, Egyptian history is one of those things that are common through history. But with King Tut's tomb, we got a whole different experience with it. And we got a whole different, like, the beginning of mass market publicity kind of elements. But we also see in the 1920s and 1930s, we see motifs of like Chinese culture in dress. We start to see the Mandarin collars and the silks and stuff. And that actually was to appeal to Barbara Hutton. The designers are really trying to appeal to her. She's very interested in Chinese culture. She can speak fluent Mandarin. She wrote Chinese poetry and Chinese characters. So that was an appeal to her, and why we start seeing it show up in our culture. Sometimes it's little things, and sometimes it's much bigger. You know, what happens when the crash happens? Like now, if we crash, back then they just shut everything down and the company was done. And now they know they can partition off and sell off different assets of the company to recuperate some cost. We also have a lot of regulations that have gone in to try to prevent that stuff from happening. It's kind of like it's a weird continuum. Sometimes it's just a building we know that we see, or sometimes it's like it's fashion. Sometimes it's just a reference in pop culture. I mean, come on, like King Tut's mask no longer travels outside of Egypt, but you know, every couple of years there's an exhibition of King Tut.
Yeah, I've been to that. I've been to that in Florida years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I saw the one that when it came through LA within the last 10 years. Polo was originally a game developed by the Persian army for the Persian king, his elite guard. I just did tennis. So it's like tennis started in the French court, and who's the first known name of a tennis player is a king because he died after a tennis match. It crosses over in Wimbledon. Like this episode 2 explains how the tie break got developed in tennis. Now it's not happened in 1929, but one of our characters, her older brother, Louise, her brother invents the tie break, which became part of the system in 1970s and is now the reason we can televise and watch tennis matches, because otherwise a tennis match could go on for 10 hours without a clearly defined winner.
Oh, wow. I didn't know. Who knew?
And another thing is like, and he's referenced, but I tell him more in the history section, is at the time, one of the biggest tennis stars is an American. He's the first American to win Wimbledon in 1920. And he's the first like 10 Grand Slam champion. And his record, which he set in 1930, is not broken until 2017 by Roger Federer at Wimbledon. So it's just like all these things that just kind of come back around. And it's like, yeah, someone who has a tennis history or interested in tennis or sports, you get it. If you're interested in financial and Ponzi, you're going to have some episodes and storylines that follow that. If you're into teen romances, it follows the development of the first marriages of Barbara Hutton and Doris Duke, and the things we really didn't know about them before they got married. So I'm demystifying the way the story is normally told, which meant I had to go back and find information because it's way more convoluted and it's way more interesting in knowing that information.
Now, Barbara Hutton is an ancestor of Lauren, right?
No, they're not related as far as I know. That's okay. No, it's fine because other people are going to want to know. Like they're going to think it is. It's not. Barbara Hutton is the heir to the Woolworth fortune, and she is one of the examples of cautionary tales. And Doris Duke is the heir to the tobacco fortune, and family founded Duke University, and she's a different kind of cautionary tale. I'm adding more flesh to the story from the frame of what we already knew.
Yeah. So one of the other things, getting back to pop culture, I was realizing how that is such a loaded question, especially with this topic, because there is the popular culture in the 20s, which you talked about, Art Deco. There is the movie The Great Gatsby, which was a book. And then there's the individuals who are part of our pop culture. Anderson Cooper, I keep going back to him, Gloria Vanderbilt. And so throughout time, we see this, and I guess I was thinking before when I first formulated that question to be a part of every episode was, where do we see it in pop culture? And I'm thinking of movies pretty much,
Yeah.
or books or, whatever. But there really is a lot more to that question. And I see that with this
Yeah.
episode.
Well, and the thing is like, I don't know if you got the Harlem Renaissance, I think is coming up. So Harlem Renaissance is related to a story regarding Cobina Wright and actually brought out one of the biggest famous Harlem choirs get discovered because of an event she hosted. And then all the things that happen after that. And they end up When Elephants Fly on Dumbo is sung by this choir. But their trajectory begins in 1928 in the episode that I describe, and how it came, like they were going to be famous no matter what, but this is how they broke out, like when you want to break out, like this was the perfect event for them to not only come out, but they came out to the elite French, English, German symphony, New York Symphony, Walter Damrosch, Maurice Ravel, all these main players in classical music, this choir performed for one night. And then it just took its own life after that. So and that's what I think is the fun part, because like, yeah, if I'm just doing history the way people used to do history, like people are going to copy me. We miss those. Like that's end up when you're reading a history book, that's like the quarter page, half page, image to the side. Oh yeah, and by the way, and that's what I always found was interesting and fascinating. And that's what makes all of it more interesting and fascinating. Because, yeah, you can think of wealthy people as just owning a bunch of Picassos. Well, it's kind of different if they actually met Picasso and he painted it for them.
What episode are you at? What number?
Today I released episode 17. I am still not quite to the crash. I wanted to really set up a world the 2 or 3 years before the crash, so that when the crash happens, it takes a year for people to realize, oh, the world's not coming back. Everyone wanted it to be 1929 again. Like the summer of 1929 was magical. You still feel like you're in the Great Gatsby, but you just don't realize it's over. And after it's over, people still want to go back to it. And it takes about a year for them to realize not. But they're acting like crazy people. Like you think when you just think, oh, well, the crash happens, of course, all the depression and all this stuff. And I was like, that's not how they saw it. They didn't know they couldn't just turn around and reverse it. I want, when you feel like they're being crazy later, I want you to kind of understand. And I want you to understand like the dynamics within certain families that was there before all of this went wrong and how much it gets magnified. I've done research for some other people in entertainment and they laugh at me. They're like, you're really passionate about history. And they laugh and they're like, because I did a project on Civil War era. And they go, you talk about these people like you went to high school with them. And high school was like 3 years ago. So I was like, when I went to do this podcast, I was like, yeah, that's how we're going to tell this story. Yeah. Because same thing, like I said, I was 17 when I went to Newport. I know what it feels like to be a teenager at that time and get your first love. I know what it's like when it falls apart. Now, it took a few more decades for mine to get all messed up, but I know what that's like. I know what the buy-in feels like. I know what the betrayal feels like. And I know like you have to move beyond it too. And sometimes that's not what they learn.
So how many episodes do you think this will be? Is it a limited series?
Nope. I just plan to tell it till it burns out. The story I'm covering is about 6 to 7 years. So hopefully that will provide, if I stay with the every other week episodes, that's at least 3 or 4 years of just straight storytelling.
Wow. Is there another podcast that's like that follows?
I don't. I'm very new to podcasting. Like I discovered podcasting because I was doing a weird admin temp job to pay bills in between trying to get this off as a TV series. So I started listening because I could listen to Aaron Mahnke's Lore. I could listen to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. I could listen to Malcolm Gladwell's multiple interviews that are published on YouTube. So at least my brain was having some kind of process going. And I was like, oh, well, fine. Wait, they're talking the way my brain works. And every time you try to think of a book, it's like it's very narrow and very focused. And You don't go off on all these little tangents and pull them back together. But I started hearing people who did that. And I was like, there's a place for me. Like,
Yeah.
there's a place for my voice, that I've been trying to do it in a one way that just really wasn't working.
Right.
It's like, I know if that's what I have to do, I can go 3 or 4 years easy. It's been a lot of fun because I get all my stuff out of it, and I'm just hoping that I infect other people.
Yeah. And that's it. That's how I approach my podcast. I've been thinking about this for a couple of years. Basically, what's your favorite history? Because I love to talk about history. I'm not a historian. So I kind of have learned a lot of the technology prior to doing this. And like you, I feel like I found my place. I'm intrigued by the way that people tell stories. And so I want to be able to tell a story in any way that you can. Is there anything else that you really want to say about your podcast, about your future projects, or, anything that you want to get out there in the...
I would love for people to start discovering it and have fun. You now get an idea of the topics and the way I'm approaching the subjects. So, I've got several years of where I'm going to be going into this stuff, and I'm going to be revisiting the same topics because it's not a one and done. Some things just keep happening.
Well,
and so
that's
it's really great to get it out and to tell people and, tell new people. So thank you for having me on your podcast.
Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to Guilty Pleasures is listening to your podcast. And it's so exciting to know that it's going to go on. Definitely, to my listeners, do yourself a favor and add this to your subscription queue, or, wherever you listen to your podcast, because I think it's like mine. You can pretty much listen to it wherever you want. All right. You take care.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
There you have it. Nicki Woodard and As the Money Burns. To find out more about Nicki and the podcast, be sure to check out our episode notes. In the meantime, thanks for joining us today. Have a great week.